Chapter 10. Church closed his eyes and remembered. So many secrets. There had been 9 on board when they'd set down, 10 if he included Judith. And he had to include her, synth or no. He'd lost his virginity to Judith, and had loved her deeply, if blindly, since he'd been about 12. She was there primarily to keep the small crew sexually satisfied, but had also been programmed as a botanist. She tended the small garden on board the Innominata, their ship, and usually prepared their meals. Jason and Lucian Church, his parents. The crew, 3 men, Taylor, Hewitt, and Johansson. They did most of the heavy work. And for that last happy month, 3 more, Quinton and Louise Clark, both scientists, and their daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca had been beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful than Judith, who could never change, never grow older, never return Paul's infatuation. Rebecca was only 2 years older than Paul, and seemed almost as interested in him as he was in her. Almost was close enough for him to dream about her. So there had been 10 of them, on their blissfully ignorant way to RLW 1289, a large settlement on a recently colonized planet where they would drop off the Clarks and then continue onward. Church's parents were terraformers, doing God's work, they used to say, then laugh, gazing at their young son and at each other with fondness and affection. Only one stop before RLW 1289, a routine data pickup, a time box from a small moon that had been terraformed 15 years before. Paul had looked forward to the stop, had hoped that perhaps he and Rebecca could slip away, walk together through the man-made Eden, and share some of their secrets with each other. Paul wanted to be a scientist, had even gotten a small grant from the government at the age of 19 for immunization research. His parents had been so proud, and he so full of youth, of ideals, of questions and the desire to be loved. And God help them, they'd set down. Lucian Church couldn't seem to stop frowning. Do you think it's safe? Paul's father shrugged easily, but he sounded a bit tense. I'm sure it's nothing. And if they're not supposed to be there, we can lift off again, okay? He smiled reassuringly at her before turning back to the controls. Everybody hold on, we're going in. The Innominata swept down through the clear and set down near the Genesis station, only a few hundred meters from the strange ship. Jason Church was a superlative pilot, only the barest jolt as the landers touched down. Paul and the others unbuckled their harnesses, stood and stretched. Rebecca smiled nervously at Paul and he returned it, trying to look calmer than he felt. Terraformed worlds were off limits to general travel, and he shared his parents' concern. There wasn't supposed to be anyone here, and yet the sensors had picked up a ship that hadn't responded to their hail. Paul heard Rebecca's mother whisper anxiously to her husband, "Smugglers?" The scientist shook his head. "I don't know, love. I hope not." Paul's father walked to the door and then smiled tightly at them. "Judith, why don't you and I go see what there is to see? The rest of you just hold tight. We'll be right back." Lucian Church frowned again but nodded, and Paul felt somewhat relieved. Judith was as strong as any of the 3 crewmen, but with better reflexes, designed not to let any bodily harm come to her human shipmates, if any harm was to be had. The 2 left the ship, the door sealing behind them. Paul and the others crowded up to the console to watch on the small viewing screen. It was hard to imagine anything bad happening in such a beautiful place. Paul had seen over a dozen planets and moons just like it, but each time he was struck by the sight. A new world, untainted by humanity. The Genesis programs were truly amazing, and his parents were good at what they did. Each project created an untamed wilderness, green and bursting with life. Judith and Paul's father reached the strange ship, a basic low-grade Class 9 jumper. The ramp was down, and Judith went in first. After a moment, Jason followed. After only a few seconds they reappeared, Paul's father making exaggerated shrugging motions towards the Innominata. The group sighed collectively, and Paul felt Rebecca's hand catch his own and squeeze it lightly before letting go. He felt a sudden flush of warmth for her, as well as a slight stirring in his groin. Jesus, Paul, grow up. He grinned at her and hoped he wasn't blushing. Almost 21 and responding like a virgin. True, she was the first girl he'd really spent any time with since puberty. Well, not including Judith. But still. His father was waving for them to come down, and Paul felt his heart leap in his chest. He loved their life, their travels and all that, but to set his feet on the ground again, there was nothing like it. Nothing at all. They usually stopped for an hour or two, spent some time just lounging around outside, breathing real air, the only human beings on an entire world. Well, maybe not this time. Where were the pilots of the other ship? Weird. Josh Hewitt, the oldest of the 3 crewmen, broke out their small weapons cache and distributed the half-dozen stun wands among them. Paul tucked his into one of his vest pockets, vaguely excited at the prospect of trouble. There wouldn't be any, of course. There never was. So he allowed himself the fantasy of taking out bad guys, saving Rebecca from a fate worse than death. "Sweetheart, are you coming?" His mother stood at the door, smiling gently at her son. God, she was actually beaming, and Rebecca was watching, a smug little smile on her own dark, pretty face. That smile was too much, it just screamed, "Aw, isn't that cute?" Shit. Paul nodded, tried to look like the scientist he was, in spite of the fact that he suddenly felt about 9 years old. Yeah, I just went to grab some juice. I'll be right down." His mother nodded, then walked down the ramp, Rebecca behind her. Paul rolled his eyes, then went to the cooler. Just him left on board, except for Taylor. The crewman was digging through his pack, probably looking for one of the stinky cigars he smoked. He smirked over at Paul. "Got a little girlfriend, Paul?" Paul scowled. "Shut up, dickhead. At least I wouldn't have to share." Taylor smiled innocently. "Hey, Judy don't mind. And who says Rebecca wouldn't share? Who says she hasn't already?" Paul tried to look angry, but he couldn't pull it off. He laughed, and after a second Taylor joined in. Paul grabbed a juice bulb and walked out onto the ramp. It was a gorgeous day, perhaps mid-afternoon on this one's cycle. The air was cool and crisp, with just the faintest undertone of... Paul frowned, sniffed. Decay? That was unusual after only 15 years. Maybe a storm had killed something recently, though it didn't smell like plant matter exactly. "Hey, you want to move, or do I knock you off?" Taylor stood behind him, an unlit cigar in his grinning teeth. "Yeah, sure," he mumbled, then hurried down the ramp, suddenly not in the mood for banter and not certain why. He walked quickly to meet the others, who stood gathered near the station by the box holder. He'd read about Eden in the history modules, the garden that the original man and woman had supposedly been ejected from, and surely the writers had imagined a place as beautiful as this as they had penned those words. Lush with bounty, as pure and fresh as a new thought, it was the stuff of waking dreams, those light, sweet fantasies just before consciousness reared. It was Eden, or as close as humanity could ever come. Beware the serpent. Paul grinned at his own pessimism, a downside to every perfection, of course. His father had entered the code for the release and was chatting with the clerks when Paul caught up. Not a clue. Looks like the ship's been deserted for at least a couple of years by the dust. Plenty of supplies, too. Louise Clark had her arms crossed tightly. She looked nervous. Maybe some sort of sickness. The crew got sick and died here. Do you smell something? I noticed it when we got off, like mold of some kind. Organic. But perhaps human? I noticed it too, said Paul. It does seem different. Jason Church removed the slim box from the holder and then nodded. All right, we've got what we came for. We'd better just leave. Contact the company when we get back in range and tell them about it. It's not our job to check this out. He smiled at Paul and then raised his voice for the others to hear. No picnic today, folks. Sorry. A few good-natured groans from the scattered crewmen, but Paul felt something in his chest loosen. Good. That ship and that weird odour had put a damper on things. He and Rebecca would just have to... He heard something then that froze his thoughts, froze everyone around him into tense silence. Chittering. An animal sound, definitely not human, and like no animal he'd ever heard. But there aren't any animals. Now a sound like metal on metal, but not mechanical. Alive. What the... Taylor, behind him. A flash of movement from behind the Genesis station, dark and incredibly fast. First one, then another, then a dozen, darting into view vaster than his stunned mind could count. Rebecca screamed, pointed, but they could all see. Alien drones. Paul had heard of them. They all had. Johansson pulled his wand, but it would be useless if the stories held any merit whatsoever. Paul spun, looked back at the ship, suddenly too far away. 3 or 4 of the dark, twisted shapes capered and crouched around it. He turned back, this time as Quentin Clark screamed out his wife's name. One of the impossibly formed creatures had dropped down, grabbed Louise Clark, and held her pinned with its spiny arms. Paul heard the blast of a stun wand, then another, and only the angry, high-pitched squeals of the unharmed drones in response. As if on cue, the aliens shrieked en masse and leapt forward to take the others, their horrible, rigid tails whipping behind them. Paul cried out, tried to run, and dark, cold arms snared him, forced his struggling limbs to his sides. They were doomed, all of them. Only brutal, terrifying death to come. Their bodies ripped to bloody pieces by the alien monster. Church opened his eyes. If only we had been so fortunate.